Welcome to Airway Breathing Conversation, a podcast presented by the anesthesiology residents at the University of Saskatchewan, created to provide individuals of all levels of medical knowledge with anesthesiology-related healthcare information. Join us this week where Dr. Jason Brooks, a performance and personal development coach, and Dr. Anne-Marie Friesen, a PGY4 anesthesia resident at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, discuss a wide array of topics related to performance, adaptability, and resiliency in medicine. Now, whether you are an anesthesiologist, resident, medical student, or member of the general public, come take a break with our host, Anesthesia PGY3, Dr. Sebastian Turcott, and a multitude of brilliant and insightful guests as we demystify the incredible specialty that is anesthesiology, one episode at a time.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Airway Breathing Conversation. We've been looking forward to this episode for a really long time. Alan and I are producer. And so thanks again, Alan, for all your hard work that you do setting this up together. We have two very special guests today. First is Dr. Jason Brooks, who is coming to us from Winnipeg right now. And he's a performance and sorry, Jason, again, we'll edit this one. Perfect. Okay, perfect. Dr. Jason Brooks coming to us from Winnipeg, who is a performance and personal development coach, and Dr. Anne-Marie Friesen, one of our co-residents here in Saskatoon as well. So thanks for both of you for joining us today.
Hi.
My pleasure.
Yeah, awesome. And why don't we just go through a little bit of a background to get started. So Jason, do you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself, what your career as a performance and personal development coach sort of looks like?
Sure. Sort of the origin story, so to speak.
Yeah.
I guess it starts quite literally when I was when I was a boy, but it kind of does. I played a lot of sports growing up, and I was a good athlete, but not the best athlete. And so I think along the way, I just started to delve into different areas that you could get an advantage in, for sport. And the more I delved into that, you started to get an appreciation for, how important the mind was, the mental side of performance. And so I think it was quite literally out of self-preservation as an athlete that initially got me into the materials, that 30 years later, whatever it is, have come to be what I do for a living. But it started there. And so I had an interest as it pertains to sport. And then I pursued that interest as I got a little bit further on into university. And then a little bit of just absolute good fortune in that where I'm located, Winnipeg, at that time, we had Dr. Calvato. He's still here, but he's since retired, who was so gracious and became a mentor of mine. This guy's a legend in the field of sport and performance psychology. And he just took me under his wing. And I was so fortunate to get mentorship experiences, actual applied experiences at an undergrad level. So, by the time I was in graduate school, I had so many experiences already. So, and then interestingly, he's the person that drew me into medicine. I'm sure we'll get into that as time goes on. But it started there. It started in sport. And I was working for years with elite performers, Olympic, national level athletes, professional athletes. And it just occurred to me as you're working with human performers dealing with stress and pressure and big expectations and high costs of failure, well, they're just human beings. I mean, the internal operating system is the same for all humans. So it seemed to me there would probably be application in other performance arenas. Mm-hmm. So I started to branch out. You work with business executives and people who are entrepreneurs who deal with the stresses and the pressures. I've worked with performance artists. And then, as I said to you, it just sort of finally wove its way into medicine. We were invited, my mentor, as I mentioned to you earlier, Dr. Calvato, we were invited at the University of Manitoba to take part in a simulation-based study. And it was for a patient, it was sponsored by a patient safety group. And they were curious to see whether or not a curriculum in, let's say, performance enhancement, performance psychology skills and strategies, if that would have some application in terms of helping physicians respond better to high stakes scenarios. So it was a group of doctors from all types of specialties. And in the first, phase of the sim, they just were exposed to crazy situations, whatever, a difficult patient interaction, a case that seems benign, all of a sudden goes to hell in a handbasket, whatever, high stakes, high stress. And they assessed kind of how they performed and had some discussions, I think, with them around that. And then my mentor, Cal, was invited to teach a curriculum. I think he taught, I forget if it was 4 or 6 sessions, on the types of things that people in your performance arena might struggle with, performing under pressure, dealing with difficult outcomes, dealing with strong personalities, maintaining confidence, like things of that nature. And at the end of it, they did a retest. And all I can say to you is since that time, I think that was in 2007, we've worked steady in medicine because word kind of spread and it developed a bit of a momentum internally. And now, it's spread far beyond Winnipeg. And, I get the chance to share these ideas with physicians all over the place. So that's kind of the origin story that takes us all the way right up until my foray into your incredibly noble but challenging performance arena.
I think we should be thanking you. You're probably helping out so many, physicians and individuals that we work with on a day-to-day basis. And like you mentioned, our jobs are stressful. And there is a performance aspect to it as well, to show up to work every day and do your best and manage some of the results of your day. And I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit. Our goal for today was actually to touch on like resiliency, both in residency and once you become a staff physician as well. Anne-Marie, I think this is a pretty important topic to you too, this idea of resiliency in residency. Something that you've discussed with our residency program before in the past. And do you mind just touching on that a little bit, like why it's so important to you?
That's fair. So I was going to start by asking like Dr. Brooks or Jason what he thought resiliency is. Because I think it's like this word that we start like throwing around.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it. Like you need stress in order to grow in life. And from what I've understood, it's kind of like your ability to like bounce back. But I feel like, and COVID having being passed and whatnot, I don't know. Sometimes it's like, okay, well, where is that line where like I'm pushing too much and like forgetting myself and like it kind of like pulling into other aspects of your life sort of thing. So that's where I'm at. So I was wondering, Jason, what would you say in your words? You've been kind of like in this like performance arena way longer than like I have. What do you think like resiliency is, or like what's a definition that would be more appropriate for us to kind of keep in mind?
Well, let's build off sort of the classical definition. So to some degree, we would define resilience as the ability to bounce back to form. Now, if we take that, let's say in the world of medicine, look, it's a pretty challenging environment. As you said, there's every single day, there's a million things that can humble you. You're going to have to face failures, difficult feedback, challenging work schedules, all the rest. So, someone who's going to be able to thrive in a performance arena like that, where it's just constant, we're going to have to develop a bit of resiliency, obviously. But the problem I have with the definition is twofold. The classical idea, again, being you go through something challenging and you have the ability to bounce back to original form. If I'm going to go through something challenging, I don't want to bounce back to original form. I better find a way to be improved by that, to make the frickin' suffering worth it. So I like to expand the definition to have opportunities to face challenges such that we find some mechanism to, as you said, Anne-Marie, grow, transform, expand as a result. The second thing I think that we need to be careful with is, and you brought up COVID. Okay, can we now declare that people in medicine are highly resilient? I don't want that to be the baseline. I don't want it to be the case that just because we can tolerate tons of shit, that we shouldn't necessarily. Like if you really want to figure out how to improve one's sense of resilience, you build capacity. Whereas I think in medicine, sometimes it happens is we almost value what we can do with less capacity. I haven't slept in 30 hours. For sure, I can still take on that task. For sure, I can still do that thing. It's, I'll work another 20. And yes, we can. It's kind of the curse of being humans who are highly capable of tough things. Secondly, I think the pressures that sometimes exist within your field, medicine, there's a culture of that. To some degree, it can be expected that we give all and sort of whatever's left, we figure out how to pull ourselves together and stay healthy. And yet that flies in the face of what resilient performers would do. They would scour the earth and themselves to figure out ways to build capacity to remain sustainably resilient come what may. And what does that look like? I mentioned earlier, I gave a big talk in the US this past March, talking to a group of residency directors. And it was similar. It was kind of post-COVID. People are struggling with confidence and competence and motivation. Maybe they're learning what was disrupted. And they're trying to figure out, how do we help people? And I knew instinctively they want, the sort of granular techniques and perspectives. And of course, I gave them that. But one of my first slides was to sort of put out almost a disclaimer that said, look, I'll give you what you want to hear, but make no mistake. The first and most important things that need to be considered are the things that aren't sexy, but that are fundamental. Sleep, exercise, nutrition, having some outlets that allow me to temporarily put aside the identity of physician and everything that it brings with it. So you can't cheat those fundamental things. I also am not naive as to think that, someone who has a career in medicine can somehow adopt all of those things to a degree where, yeah, it's great. Now I'm playing hockey 6 nights a week. I wish you could. I'm not so naive to think that might not be difficult. But if we can get better at putting systems in place to give us a chance to, take care of the machine, both internally, but also in terms of just our experience on Earth, having important relationships, finding time to do other things, meaningful activities, etc. To me, that's how you build resilience. It's not just a process of attrition that we drag you through enough, and those who can withstand it, congrats. You're resilient. You don't get into medicine without being resilient in the first place. Nobody cruises into residency pulling B's and C's like I may have. Okay. You've got to be pretty darn capable of stress and pressure and challenge to begin with. So.
Okay. I get that. And I appreciate that. And I might be like taking this a bit far. I find that the danger, and I don't know if you guys agree, but because we're such in a field where production and success is important, it feels like those other aspects, as much as they are deemed as being wellness, become also like a check mark or another task, if that's fair to say. And so I feel like they're not so much an outlet. I'm probably drawing from personal experience where I find that sometimes like Jason and I connected from a sports background. I used to powerlift and now I bodybuild. And I feel like, yeah, that was supposed to be an outlet, but it very much can become another task and another thing that's added to my plate. And that's where I'm like, okay, well, how do you make sure that just doesn't happen? I guess it's kind of living with intent sort of thing, but do you have kind of tips or anything to suggest to say that, okay, this is something that brings you or contributes to your wellness and not just an added thing? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, I will say you're a little bit unique in that you compete as a bodybuilder. So, to be able to be in peak performance for something like that, yeah, it's going to require a consistent level of commitment that I'm sure for you personally makes it challenging at times with all the other requirements in terms of residency. I just think for me, it's a matter of if we allow the 2-week in Mexico approach to be the only piece of significant recovery and detachment we get once a year, we're just on the fast track to burnout, or at least to lose a sense of meaning and purpose and fun in what we do. So to me, it's, can you find ways to optimize some of those things within the micro moments of your day? That's why I believe in systems. So you said, okay, if all of a sudden someone was doing none of those things and decided tomorrow, oh, great, now I got to, hire a nutritionist, hire a strength coach,
Right.
hire a sleep, whatever. I get that. We don't want to overwhelm ourselves. We're already starting from a place of overwhelm, most likely. So you step back, and I'm a big believer in something that a colleague said. So Dr. Salim Rizai, who's an emergency medicine physician in the US. So to sort of illustrate your point, Emery, when you've got so much going on, how do you stay consistent, and how do you not allow that to become the thing that puts you over, right? So, and he's fine with me sharing this story because he shared it many, many times publicly. So just before COVID, 2019, I think, he, 3 of his closest friends, and he's younger than I am, he's probably in his early 40s. 3 of his closest friends suffered heart attacks in the same year. And so, you talk about the proverbial wake up call, it just shook him to his core.
Mm-hmm.
And, here's a guy that historically had been very fit and active. But again, all of a sudden you take a life in medicine and it's very easy to lose sight of all of the other things in your life that you used to do that, that help buffer against some of the stress and pressure, et cetera. So, and like most people, I'm sure he had tried previously to, you get that New Year's resolution spike of momentum or whatever. And, he'd attempted to stay on a program and, you fall off. And so the more you do that, you're creating even more resistance for the next time you're going to do it because, do you even trust that you can stay with it? So anyways, he really took this to heart, what had happened to his friends. And he said to himself, I want to do this and I want to make this work. So he sort of did the right thing. He stepped back and said, what has been the difficulty? And it's so easy when we get caught up in the slipstream of too many tasks and too many responsibilities to say, well, what do you mean? What's been the resistance? There's no time. There's no energy. I just can't do it. It's like, hang on a sec. I know that's how it feels because you're overwhelmed. So he recognized that if he wasn't careful, he was going to fall victim to the same cycle of coming out of the gates hard and then recognizing, holy fuck, I can't sustain that, and falling off, which would just more disappointment, more resistance. So he said, I absolutely went counter to that. His approach that he took was, he said, I am going to be committed to the aggregation of marginal gains approach. This is his wording. And he said, what that meant was...
That's very specific. I like it.
Yeah. I love that wording.
Yeah. And specifically what that means is, and he's brilliant, he said, look, if I come out too hard, it triggers a ton of resistance. I'm already in a state of overwhelm. And it's almost like, this might sound funny, it's almost like there's a part of me that wants to feel that so that I can follow the same exact outcome. And then it doesn't work, and then I fall off, and it's medicine's fault. And so he said, I wanted to avoid that. So again, he recognized if he came out doing this in a way that allowed less resistance to build, odds are he could sustain it. So what does that look like? So let me give an example. So the first 3.5 months that he committed to lifestyle and behavior change, physically speaking, that is, he didn't do anything physical. He said, I started with one task, and that was he kind of wrote out almost like a pyramid of his eating choices, with the tip of the spear being the shittiest to whatever was better. And he said, my first and only goal was, can I transition from regular soda pop, you like to drink that, to diet? And the average person would go, oh, God, what is the point of this? I mean, 20 years before I lose an ounce of weight or, whatever his goals were. But he recognized it was brilliant because what he's really up against is not an inability to sustain a life change. He's up against the fact he doesn't trust that he can. And so if you go slow, it took 3 weeks, guess what? He had defeated, if you will, regular soda pop. And then he transitioned to whatever was next. I have no idea, potato chips. And so it took 3.5 months, such that by the time he was ready to do the physical part, which, is hard, you're going to have a lot of resistance if you're not ready for it. He had stacked together so many mental wins that he was beginning to trust that he could. So to go back to your question, Anne-Marie, you don't decide if you've never done any of those things for the last 5 years, you don't leave this call and hire a strength coach, nutritionist. You pick one thing. You start with one thing and you earn the right to trust that I can embed more of this in my life. And I work through the resistance that's telling me I can't. And what happens is, as you allow more life in, there'll be a gravitational pull. You'll find ways to then expand that goal or that change to some other area of your life, and we can sustain it that way. I'll tell you a funny story about that. I was working with a physician, gosh, this is 15 years ago, if it was a day, and super keen, professional, was in his first year of residency, was so committed, to doing it. I think possibly a little bit of imposter, which maybe was driving some sort of the obsessive behavior. But so we're having a conversation. He's really struggling. I see some hands up in the air.
I was just going to say, we could probably relate to the imposter syndrome a little bit. Yeah,
for sure. I'm sure we'll touch on that. It's a big, experience that certainly I've observed in sport of medicine. But back to him. And so he was so, caught up in the idea that, everything else in life had to take a pause because medicine. And so he met with me because he said he was struggling to find recovery. And he said, I've got 3 weeks vacation upcoming. And he says, I'm hoping I can carve out an hour in there for myself. And I thought he meant an hour a day. And I thought, that's atrocious. You're on 3 weeks vacation. Because in his mind, he thought, I've got to study, I've got to be switched on in medicine, etc. And it was worse because when I delved a little deeper, he was hoping he could find an hour, a singular hour in the 3 weeks to do a thing. And I'm thinking, oh my God, to use hockey parlance, we're just gripping the stick way too tight here.
Yeah.
So we started to talk about that. And I said, okay, if you were to allow yourself that hour, look, he's struggling. I'm going to work within the resistance as it is. What would you even do? And he said, I had a bunch of hobbies before. I like to cycle. I like to work out, whatever it was. I said, well, pick one. And let's find the time to do that. And let's see if we can do that early in your break. And let's see if by virtue of doing that, we might allow ourselves to do a bit more. And so long story short, starting with as small as that, can you find an hour or a few hours in your 3 weeks vacation to do something, not only that you love, but more importantly, that allows you to step outside of this singular identity, or so it feels. Remind yourself, oh yeah, there is more to life than what I do. There is more to life than the role that I, perform professionally. And if I don't show myself and allow those other parts of me in, it will become all consuming. Flash forward 1 year, I saw him again, and he was gearing up for his first marathon. And guess what? Residency didn't get less demanding.
Mm-hmm.
In year 2, it became more. But you recognize that as soon as he allowed in better, there was a gravitational pull, and he started to relax, and he started to trust that he could. And that changed everything. And I firmly believe that, not made that choice, just that pressure vacuum over time, it would have caused all sorts of difficulties, as one can suspect. Just the burnout, the obsessiveness, the constant fear and anxiety. So it's possible. But if we come out of the gates too hard, it's likely we will produce way too much resistance and we will fall off. So how do we protect against that? By taking the tortoise and the hare approach, more of the tortoise, but an intentional tortoise approach, because there's a part of me that needs to earn the right to trust that I can make these changes.
That's, super insightful. And I'm trying to just take it all in because
aggregation of marginal gains.
Yeah. Because I find, it's amazing.
Together, small gains.
I find I get a tough week at work, and maybe I'm not exercising. Like for me, my outlet is exercise, whether it's cycling in the summer or maybe a spin bike in the wintertime, or maybe a workout or something like that. But if I have a tough week at work, then I'm telling myself, oh well, I'll just get back on the horse next week, right? But then, next week gets busy again, or you get a new block because our residency are through monthly blocks. And then with every block, there's a schedule change, and then you don't quite have your schedule quite ready. But I think just flipping that, like, instead of thinking about it just next week, because you're going to set yourself up for failure if you don't accomplish that task next week, but rather if you think about it over 3 months or with smaller wins, that's sort of what I'm gaining from that. And that's a different perspective.
It has, especially in, worlds like yours where, to Anne-Marie's point, the original question is, it's because there's so much else going on. So if I don't systemize those efforts, it's going to be extremely tough to stay consistent. What's that beautiful quote from James Clear's book? We don't rise to the level of our goals, we sink to the level of our systems. And what do I mean by a system? It's not some grandiose theoretical concept. It means, okay, if I wanted, for example, to add exercise into my day, I zoom out, I look at my schedule, I figure out what would be, there's probably no perfect time, but what would an optimal time be? What day? How long? And then I zoom all the way out and go, what would need to be in place in order for me to stay consistent with this? I'll give an example. So this was during COVID. I had a physician reach out to me, and her challenge, if you will, was precisely this. She had fallen out of physical shape. I'll just say that this was her concern. Her gym was closed. There's a lot of family pressures during COVID, kids are at home, et cetera. So, understandable that she would, maybe lose a bit of momentum there. And so we were having a conversation, and she said, and Jason, I'm doing everything. I hired a trainer. I've got an exercise routine I can do at home. I've been given sort of a rough idea of nutritionally speaking, better meals I can prepare, etc. I just can't stick with it. And it's all my fault, and I'm not this, I'm not that. And I go, well, hang on a sec. Before we deem you irredeemable and incapable, let's step back and let's look at the system that you're employing. And for her, she had a very busy professional day, obviously, as a physician. And then on top of that, had, kids that were of a young age that required a lot of her time and energy and attention, down to preparing meals and getting homework done and, bath times and all the rest of that. And so we looked at a day in the life. And so it was, wake up, go to work, come home, make the dinner, clean the dinner, make the lunches, get the homework done, get the bath done, and then finish my paperwork. And if I'm lucky, hopefully around 11 p.m. or so, I attempt to go do my workout. And I said, I got great news for you. You have no inability to stick to a program. You have a shitty system that you're trying to. I don't know anybody who, after a day like that, is going to be able to will themselves consistently to work out at the end of such a exhausting day. And the second part to that is, if I have to use will to get myself to do the thing I want to do all the time, that's another indicator that it's probably not going to be something you can sustain. So again, without knowing for sure if we could help her, I said, in a perfect world, what would better look like for you? And she said, what do you mean? I said, if you could work out anytime that you wanted, whatever many days of the week. I don't know if we can create that for you, but I'd rather we focus on what we want than what we can't create. So she said, honestly, 2 or 3 times a week, right at 5 o'clock or whenever she gets home, give me an hour and I'd be in heaven. And so we looked at that and said, okay, so judging on what you told me about kind of your daily schedule, it seems that preparing dinner would be sort of the sticking point there, right? She said, yeah. I said, okay, for your consideration for a month, again, just to work through the resistance, to show me that it's not true that I can't stick to a program, would you be willing to hire a meal prep service for 3 meals of the week for a month? And she agreed to it. And in doing so, a few things happened. Was better able to stay consistent. Secondly, worked through the resistance that said that she couldn't. And next thing you know, voila, it's in motion. So again, this is not some big, profound thing. If you want to have more downtime in your personal life, what would it take? Okay, when do I need to close the books of studying? What would need to be in place? So I've got young kids. Can my spouse or partner take care of them? The gym is super close to work. Okay, like something simple. Can I bring my gym gear with me? The smallest of things, if I can replicate it, I can stay consistent. And if I figure out a system, the odds of sustaining it are far greater than it's like I hear people say all the time, I'm looking to meditate, as an example. It could be anything, do yoga, do whatever. As soon as I hear someone say, I'm looking to meditate, it's like, okay, save yourself the time. You're not going to. You're going to do it twice, like Alan had mentioned. And, and somehow miraculously 3 months later, you'll remember, God, I stopped meditating. Yeah, that's not the same as, what? I'm looking to commit to meditation. I figured a way in my schedule. I have a block right before I leave for work from 7:45 to 8 a.m. My wife or partner will take care of the kids. I'm going to turn off my phone. And that's the system. That's all we're talking about. Like, if I have that in place and it's understood by me and the people around me, this is important. It will be met.
Okay, so I'm hearing that setting up your systems is important. Now, you also touched on something about kind of like your inner dialogue. And I feel like probably a lot of your high performance athletes, physicians struggle with the idea that if like I'm doing this and I'm not doing it like to perform or have success with it, I'm probably not going to dabble in it. Now, I also see how like sometimes we're faced with situations, or I'll say hardship, where there's like, and I think this is where like imposter syndrome kind of like this like whole dialogue of like, not being good enough, or you kind of like don't want to dabble into something because you're afraid you're not going to actually reach it. And I don't remember what you said, that lady told herself that like it just wouldn't happen. Or I guess my question is, how do you kind of like, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past about changing like your narrative in order to allow yourself to do some things and allow kind of like to grow into something?
Yeah, I would say this. I would start first with emotions. I've always viewed emotions as signals. So if, let's say, the inner critic, the inner voice of imposter, the ego, you could call it Larry. I don't care what we call the voice that has all these images of you're not this enough or that enough, you're not ready enough, prepared enough, skilled enough. That voice, we all have that voice that carries those types of stories and comes from that type of energy. The most important thing I could do is when I start to take on those thoughts and feelings, that the energy of that, can I recognize that in that moment, I'm losing me. It is no longer Anne Marie or Alan who is perceiving the situation or themselves. It is essentially my emotional history that's jumped into view, hijacked my perspective on things, and that's what I'm looking at life through the lens of. So if I can differentiate between an inner critic in my mind that sometimes speaks to me in its old familiar frame and the fact that beneath what that voice is saying or causing me to feel is Anne Marie or is Alan, who has more to them than what I'm caught up in, committed to thinking and feeling in the moment. That's what imposter syndrome is. It's twofold: an inability to acknowledge one's actual capabilities or abilities. But secondly, it is a commitment to feel not good enough. And so beneath the voice who's telling me that I'm not good enough is some other truths that we cannot even connect to when you're caught up in the energy of not good enough. So to your question, Anne-Marie, the first step is, can you just make space for the fact you have this sort of inner critic, we all do, and that when it starts to speak on my behalf, it doesn't have the full truth behind it. So the first thing is take whatever stories it's projecting to us in that moment. Okay, stepping into a crazy surgical situation you've not been in. Oh my God, I'm not good enough. I'm not this enough. All the fear, all the imposter, all the doubt. And so as soon as you recognize I'm losing me here, it's like, stop, take a step back. Let's just remember what's happening here and ask yourself, who's talking to me right now? Who's talking to me? Is it Anne-Marie in a balanced state, knowing that beneath how she feels, she has some skills, she has some experience, she's got a team around her, she's been in tough spots before, more times than not it goes well? No, I don't. I have access to none of those truths when I'm caught up in an energy that feels like not good enough, right? And if I am not the arbiter of truth to that inner critic, the inner critic will become me. And it's unfortunate because most of its stories are rooted in complete lies and bullshit, if you really break it down. And I make space for the fact that people have had bad experiences and feel a certain way. But I would still suggest that just because you've had a bad experience does not guarantee that that will happen again. It just feels that way. So you meet that inner critic. The best definition of fear that I've ever heard is that fear is need announcing itself. So you have that inner voice that is fearful. Oh my God, this situation's upcoming that gives me stress or concern, makes me feel not good enough, skilled enough, whatever enough, right? And under that energy, we lose you. So what does that part of you need to calm down? I like to use the analogy, I don't know if anybody here has kids, but you've been around young kids. If you had a little kid around you that was absolutely melting down, right? Whatever, someone stole their toy. In that meltdown state, for you to calmly, rationally explain to them why it's not such a big deal, no kid in the history of having a meltdown will have ever calmed down just by telling them something rational. It's like, okay, they're scared, they're upset. What does that child need first? What's the resistance? Is it that they're not aware that sometimes in life's not fair? No, they're just caught up in their feelings. So the first thing we would do to have a chance to help them see a different way of thinking about it is to meet them at their energy. show them some compassion. Hey, come here, come in close, give you a hug. What's going on? It's okay. The child quiets down a little bit to enough degree where now we can have more of a rational discussion. Now I can bring more information to the situation that they could not see when they're caught up in all that emotion. Well, guess what? It's no different as whatever your old adults you are. We still have that inner 5-year-old that at times gets afraid and anxious and wonders if we're good enough. And it needs the same thing from us, some compassion. And beneath giving it some compassion, it needs some reassurance. I work with a lot of athletes. And so one of the strategies I like to use, and I've used this with a ton of physicians as well, we already know what some of those situations could be that cause us to feel like an imposter. So we have that, we can work backwards. So one of my athletes is a professional mixed martial arts fighter, fights in the UFC. And anytime he has a fight, as you can appreciate, I don't care if you've had one fight or 100 fights, it's the worst day in the history of the world. I mean, just the nerves, the stress, the pressure, the anxiety. It's, the day of is mostly spent managing your energy to make sure that stuff doesn't overcome you. But of course, there's no magic formula that's somehow going to create Zen state on the day. It's like, look, fear has an evolutionary value. It's to protect you from a threat. This guy's going to fight in front of thousands of people. That qualifies as pretty legitimate fear in my eyes. So there's nothing irrational about that we're feeling it. However, when we get caught up in it, it then spirals in irrational directions. Oh my God, am I really well trained as I think I am? Can I really be the southpaw? Like these types of ideas. So we ready for that. We know it's going to come. The imposter will be strong on that day. And we have him create ahead of time a list on his phone, his notes section, facts over fears, which is to say, when the inner critic, the voice of resistance, whatever we want to call it, when it comes up and starts speaking to me, how will I give it what it needs and what does it need? So we actually have a list, and I'll say to him, okay, since the last time you've performed till this time, and specifically stepping into this fight, what are the most important things? So he populates a list, and maybe it's his jujitsu or some specific aspect of that. Maybe it's his weight cut. I don't know what it is, but he does. He puts all these things down. And I say, okay, let's Likert scale. I want you to rank these things at this point in time, whether they are the worst they've ever been, 1 through to 5, the best they've ever been. Well, much like residents who work their ass off every single day to be as good as they can, he can honestly look at that list of the most important things and say everything, if he's at a good training camp, is the best it has ever been. That's not bullshit positive thinking. That's the truth. The lie is somehow what fear is telling us. Are you sure we're ready? Are you sure we're gonna? That's the lie. And you can't fix a freaking lie. What we do rather is connect the fear to the truth that it cannot see because it's caught up in fear. And as soon as we make that connection, guess what? Temporarily, the fear, like an excited child, calms down and we can step into the next moment, more present, less activated, until 15 minutes later or 5 seconds later when it starts again, and we just repeat. And we meet that energy and we bring it down. But all the while, we're teaching ourselves beneath how I feel, okay, there's more. There is more. It's you. The fear is the lie.
Okay.
I hear that. And then my mind is like going like a million things at once. I'm sorry to cut you off, Seb. But so what I'm thinking or what I'm kind of drawing in my head is like kind of building those systems to make sure you look after your wellness or what have you.
Yeah.
Does that give you ammunition or kind of like a setup or a background in order to kind of like address or meet that inner critic and deal with it? Or is that like something completely separate that adds to like your wellness?
Well, I think that it would certainly be a force multiplier. I mean, if you can find a way to systemize and stay consistent with things in your life that will add value, whether they, better nutrition through to, more social opportunities or whatever gives you joy, then I think it's consistently going to help you, stay sustainable as you go through. So I think they become force multipliers, if that makes sense. If you have a system and can stay in better health in whatever way it matters to you, you're going to have more capacity. You're going to feel more confident, and you're going to feel like you can meet the challenges more head on.
Mm-hmm. That's that's a really good point. Like just how to manage your life outside of work a little bit to try and help
Yeah.
you while you're at work. And then
Well, it's interesting. Sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say my question is sort of when you do recognize that fear, whether it's at work or outside of work,
Yeah.
and then we sort of touched on, just taking a step back, giving yourself some grace, giving yourself some compassion.
Way easier said than done, by the way.
Totally. And I would say residency is sort of this sort of based on milestones where you finally start to get comfortable with a skill or a procedure or a different environment, and then you graduate from that milestone, and then you get thrown into something else that sort of makes you scared. And it's this balance of reaching out for help, whether it's a staff physician or other nurses or other team members in the OR, for example, because we work in anesthesia. It's a balance of reaching out for help when you need it versus trying to push yourself to grow and become a little bit more independent, because the goal at the end of residency is to become an independent physician and staff member. So do you have any advice or insight on how to balance that need for reaching out for help versus trying to let yourself grow in the moment a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I would challenge the idea of needing to be independent at the end of residency. So when you write your Royal College exam and they give you the thumbs up, you pass, and your first official staff shift is whatever, July 7th. Is it true that anything changes? Like if you didn't know what you were doing, could you ask someone? I always tell people who are starting their first staff shift, okay, you're a resident graduate plus a day. That's where you're at. Whereas the expectation is somehow the mysteries of the universe reveal themselves, or they should, the moment you become staff. That's ridiculous. So how do you help yourself? Allow yourself to carry forward similar expectations. Now, I make space that you need to know more, perhaps, as the person who leads the show.
Sure.
But imagine if you could allow yourself the grace and humility to still be a learner, to be able to look at a resident when you're a year into staff and say, I'm not really too familiar with it. Do you know? And it be okay. Wouldn't that be the strongest way to protect yourself? To alleviate, a guy whose work I really love actually took a 6-month mastermind when I think Henry and I were talking about this. His name's Peter Crone. He has this beautiful way of looking at, problems in life. He says, most of life's problems, and I couldn't agree more, aren't actually real materially. They're real to the degree that our perspective is committed to thinking and feeling a certain way about them. And so what he likes to say is much of life's problems, we're not there to solve per se, but we just need to dissolve the way that we're looking at them to take away the problem. So, again, what would be the antidote to feeling a ton of stress and pressure once you're done residency? I'm independent. I have to know it all. It's on me. Would be to recognize that's bullshit. That's not even true. If on day one of being a staff, I didn't know what I was doing in a moment, what's the actual answer to the question, what would I do? I'd ask someone, no different than I did the week before when I was just a 5th-year resident. So allow yourself some grace. Allow yourself to not have to know everything. You got to know a lot, obviously. But if you can bring that humility, oh my God, what it will save you in terms of just being distracted by more anxious thoughts and feelings to have to be the know-it-all would be exponential. And it's interesting. There's sort of I would dovetail that with a phenomenon that we see in sports a lot. And that is the idea of, whether you're the favorite or whether you're the underdog, like the contender. And if you're the favorite, the pressure's on you, have to win, have to come through. If you're the underdog, it's like, look, I'm hungry to win, but if we don't, it's okay. We're not expected to. And I don't say that to devalue winning, not at all. But if you think about it psychologically, it takes the pressure off. So much of that additional distraction factor is just my mind convincing me, no, I have to know it all. Do you really? Do you really? You don't. And if you let go of that pressure, it's funny, you'll find out you know more than you do because you won't put that pressure on you that could distract.
I like that. And then my mind goes to I think that's the point of creating kind of maybe a culture of for lack of a better word, vulnerability or
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it could be helpful to your colleagues too, because we're sort of all in this together at work.
Yes.
And if you allow yourself that humility, then maybe you show to others too.
Correct.
That they can also demonstrate that humility. And I find, I really struggled early on in residency. Just, was I matching, the learning trajectory as my peers, right?
Right.
Or you compare yourself to senior residents who have already been doing it for 4 years, and you're like, am I actually going to get to that point? But then I think we have I would say we're very lucky in this program that we have such supportive residents, but I finally started to learn just a little bit that like you can just reach out to your colleagues, you can just reach out to your peers and get their own insight on things, and then understand that we're all actually just in this together, and these feelings of anxiety that I feel around a certain day or a case, something that somebody's gone through before, and somebody after me will also go through it.
Yeah,
I love that. If I could add to that, two things. So you talk about, imposter thoughts and feelings in medicine. And of course, one of the core ideas, or the way that it's perceived by people, is I feel like I'm the only one, right? And I like to tell people, in, I don't know how many years now, 17 or so years working in medicine, I've not met the one that doesn't. I don't care who they are. You could send me the most brash, seemingly narcissistic, whatever. If you sit them down for an hour and talk about, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I promise you. And I could tell a very powerful story about that. But I wanted to remind you, I'm 50, I forget stuff. But go back to something that Anne-Marie said about vulnerability. So I get asked a lot, and I've been asked this tons in medicine, talks I give or seminars or whatever, but also in other performance arenas. And people will ask me, when it comes to building a team, or it comes to building a work culture, what would you say is the most important attribute? I always don't like the what's the most important thing, because there's lots of things, but I play along and I'll say, okay, for me, by far the most important attribute is vulnerability. And you hear a pin drop, like, this is the worst speaker ever. What's he talking about?
that is
Well,
hard.
I know what you want me to say. I know you want me to say communication and teamwork, but those are all downstream of vulnerability. If we would say, okay, does good communication matter in a strong team? Yes, of course it does. Okay. Where does good communication come from? Well, you have to build some trust that, we can share things and etc. Okay. So if trust is related to communication and communication is related to teamwork, what precedes trust? If I want to earn Anne-Marie's trust, I have to be willing to be vulnerable to give her a chance to earn my trust. I have to be able to say, Anne-Marie, I fucked up. I don't know. I'm not sure. I got this wrong. Can you help me? I have to be able to do that to earn her trust. Once we do, all those other downstream team effects have a chance, but it starts with vulnerability. And if you think of, it's getting better, but if you think in medicine, if you had a seminar with staff and everything else, and someone said, hey, today we're going to do something different. Let's all be really vulnerable, right? Yeah. Anne-Marie, if you can't see, I don't know if this is just an audio podcast. There was
oh, we've got video.
There was a cringe.
You could tell, that would just be oof. And yet, ironically, it is the pathway to better. It's the pathway to feeling more free, more supported, more at ease, because to your point, everybody's in this together, Sebastian, like you said.
Amazing.
Yeah. My next question is okay, that's very nice. How do you cultivate that in a system, in a group?
Well, I'll tell you at a micro level, it usually just takes one or two courageous people to start to set a different tone. And also, I don't necessarily go in expecting everybody to follow form. People are people. They're going to do what they need to do and what they think is right. But if you know that it works better for you and you demonstrate a better way, I promise you there will be a gravitational pull where others will want, to do and see and feel things more in the direction that you're committing to. So that's one part of it. I'll tell you something interesting though. I was working with a group in Canada during COVID. And when I first met with them, it was, early days, pure crisis, before the protective mask situation was sorted through. And, people were still wondering, do I have to leave my home and, to spread COVID, just the total panic days, early days. And so I met with him and asked how his team was doing. And he said, obviously the stress is to the max. It's like a pressure cooker. He says, but what's interesting? He said, the department's never been more collegial. We've never been closer. He says, people that we didn't think even emoted are showing feelings. They're scared, they're nervous, they're uncertain, whatever. And so in some respects, it only took COVID to allow us to have the courage to be vulnerable. And you go, why? because that was an event that instantaneously made everybody vulnerable. Nobody had the answers. Didn't matter if you were first year resident or 20-year staff. Like, who has all the answers? Nobody. So now it just becomes almost more primitive. In times like that, the tribe naturally bands together. And so it was fascinating because it wasn't just supporting each other through the throes of COVID, but as a result of people being vulnerable and opening up, other things started to happen. There was a craft brew club that started amongst the staff. This is when we were all doing online Zoom calls with each other. There was a baking club. It just, like, social things started to take place. So this is amazing, which also just goes to show you, if you want to change a culture, you can in an instant if everybody is committed to sort of a shared vision of what better would look like. Now, flash forward that same year, but now closer to the summer. If you recall, initially, COVID kind of died down a bit. So I come back in. How are things going? It's like, the pressure is still there just because people are working their ass off. He says, I said, how's the team stuff? He says, it kind of petered out. And I go, yeah, I'm not surprised, because as soon as the danger was away, people felt less need to be vulnerable, and we kind of resort back to our regularly scheduled program. So you can change it in a heartbeat, but it has to be sustained. So if you're going to be someone that wants to bring something that you value more to a workplace culture, like, say, being vulnerable, asking for insight if you don't know, being okay with that, just know that you're going to attract a lot of people to that, but not everybody. And that's okay.
Yeah. That's fair. You can, at a micro level, you can only do so much, and bring what you bring to the table and be vulnerable to others and see how they react.
But to your point, Sebastian, just if we could all just bring that, if the three of us, if not just Anne-Marie decided to bring whatever, I don't know, a better attitude to her shift tomorrow, but if you and I did as well, it's like, and three more people, like, that is what I can do. I can influence me. We used to do this exercise. We still do. We're working with, teams such as yours, and you'd say, okay, like, as best as we can, we're human. We're going to have moments where, we allow certain things to come out of us that maybe is not ideal, but have we even had a conversation amongst us as residents or as staff? What do we want in here? Like, when we are here in the OR, in our department, in the hospital, like, what are the behaviors and energies, if you will, that we do want in here? And what are the same that, if we could be better at managing ourselves, we'd like to exclude from here? Okay, we want support, collegiality, vulnerability. We don't want gossiping, complaining, and whatever else. Okay, you go, oh my God, how could we possibly change the whole culture? You don't. You commit to you doing that. And if you do that, and I do that, and Sebastian does that, and 10 other people do that, we can sustain it.
Yeah.
But I focus on what I can do. It's me.
Yeah.
Right? It's all of that, yeah.
Hello, listeners. Thanks again for tuning into this incredible podcast. We've actually turned it into a two-parter, so please check in again next week as we continue our conversation with Dr. Brooks. And again, thanks for all the support. We'll talk to you next week. Cheers.
You've been listening to Airway Breathing Conversation, a podcast hosted and presented by the anesthesiology residents at the University of Saskatchewan. Please note that while this podcast is run by healthcare professionals, it is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. We are very thankful to our guests for taking the time to share their wisdom with us this episode, and a very special thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Don't forget to follow us and our associated USask Anesthesia accounts on social media. You can find all our social media links on our Linktree page at linktr.ee/abc_podcast. You can also find the department's social media links on their Linktree page at linktr.ee/usask_anesthesia. We'll see you next episode, but until then, stay calm, take a breath, and always remember your ABCs.